Hello, Murray. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jack.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. So we are going to talk about your three important albums. Before we get to those, I want to ask about your new mini album. I think it's being termed as Strawberry Season on Leaving Records. So take me back initially to the beginning of this one. What were the first parts of this record, whether, I don't know, conceptual or sonic or an idea or whatever, that put this in motion for you, Strawberry Season?
Sure. So I started work on this almost exactly a year ago. A lot of this just kind of came to be from wanting to. I guess let me back up a little. I had a couple of sort of like bigger life events around this time. I went on this tour with a band I'm in called Alex Alone. And on this tour, I reconnected with someone I was friends with and had a crush on in high school. And like one thing led to another, and now we're dating and live together.
Oh, wow.
Uh,
Congrats. That's cool.
but one of the things with reconnecting with my partner, my current partner, was that like we had this whole history and shared a lot of music together. And as I started like reconnecting with her, as also she's a musician as well. I makes music as Pame, Pam with a three, and a lot of our taste had grown in conjunction with one another. Like we were interested in a lot of the same contemporary music, but also we shared this really rich like history of listening to things from the early 2000s. And so I think a lot of Strawberry Season was kind of like seeing the like the past in the present and the future, and being struck with how a lot of that music feels very contemporary and exciting, and kind of exploring that in a very direct way with the work I was doing. And so this meant kind of like getting back in touch with things that I initially fell in love with musically. I grew up playing a lot of folk music and playing fiddle and violin. And this is definitely, I think, one of the most string oriented records I've released. I think there's violin on almost every track except for maybe two. And
Hmm.
so there's a lot of strings, and I got back into kind of like writing and recording with the violin quite a bit. And then also merging that though with a lot of the practices like I've been doing in my art and my work for recent years. So a lot of field recording and also a lot of electronics, using the Teenage Engineering OPZ a ton on this music, and also in Electron Cycles. And so a lot of this is like kind of this acknowledgement of like looking to kind of like the past and reflecting on that, but in this way that it like informs the present and the future. A few months ago, my partner Pamela and I also watched Twin Peaks: The Return. It was my second viewing of it, and it was her first. And in that, they talk about this like, is it future? Is it past? And I feel like that also was something that just like really struck me while working on this material too, of just like feeling like it's kind of like out of time, in
Hmm.
a way, like sort of like loosened from time, and sort of trying to pull all of these things into it. And so a lot of the first songs I was working on, I started kind of like channeling this, but it wasn't necessarily super conscious at first, which is kind of how I feel like most of my albums and recordings goes. It's like it takes me a couple of tracks to kind of get into it until I realize what I'm actually doing. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I think I'm like really tapping into this. But one of the first tracks I worked on was Gentle Pets, and immediately it just felt like completely different for me. I made like a lot of music that has played with folk and like acoustic instruments before, but I think that that's really one of the most overt examples of that. But it still didn't feel that removed, because even though there's all these acoustic guitars and shaker and violin, there's still like very processed vocals and like little kind of blippy synth sounds. And so that was like one of the first things. And I started working on a lot of this material like right before leaving to go on tour with Lomelda and
Hmm.
Alex Alone again. And so I worked on a handful of these tracks, like actually on tour with them as well. The tracks Cold and Souped were things I made basically like in the back of the van while having all of these really big feelings about like, seeing this person that I have, had a crush on most of my life and kind of like processing that and then that sort of causing all of this reflection and like sort of reframing of everyday environmental sounds and like kind of how I felt about approaching my own music in the process. So it was like I definitely feel like, there's a part of it that's also kind of was made in transit in that way and sort of like being very journalistic and diaristic in terms of capturing like kind of, found sounds and really working with what was available to me in a given moment.
Hmm. Now, what I love is the runtime is pretty fleeting, right? But you feel like, certainly, definitely with my first listen and continually afterwards, actually, you're forever unpicking what you think the record is with each piece. Like the
Good.
first,
Yeah, love to hear that.
but also with something that sprawls like that, like as you say, you've got Gentle Pets, but then you veer into completely different terrain as the record goes, and that keeps happening. I've heard you say in an interview before about the fact that you generally go through a phase of just hating what you're making and then having to kind of attack it again when you feel kind of rejuvenated to do so. Did that happen at all with Strawberry Season?
I would say it actually probably happened less with this than
Right, cool.
other records. Gentle Pets in particular was something where I was like, okay, yeah, this feels like new territory in a big way. And same thing with Cold too. That was like another moment of just feeling like, oh, like I'm getting into some territory that like feels familiar, but it's also sort of running wild with a lot of ideas that I've had. I mean, I think the one thing I did kind of go through with this is I felt sort of secure about it, like as a record, I think initially, because it does have like, it does go a lot of places. I think it goes a lot of places and is more different perhaps than other records I've made, which I feel like is saying a lot. Um, but
Yeah.
but that being said, I had that kind of assuaged when I sent it to I with Tamela, my partner, who is very non. She does not hold back with criticism or feedback, and I also sent it to like some other friends and collaborators, and was just like, yeah, I want kind of like to know what you think, and was just like it makes perfect sense as a record. And I think a lot of that
Yeah.
is because it's like kind of capturing these specific moods and themes, even though it is very diverse. And I think the element of it being fleeting is like pretty crucial too,
Hmm.
in terms of like having that sense of like this is it. Like we kind of like have this moment of bliss, and then it fizzles away.
Yeah.
And so that's like a very intentional thing. And so it's one of those things where it's like kind of the sequencing and everything, like it made sense to me, but I was really concerned if it was going to make sense to anyone else. And I was pretty happy when everyone I shared it with was just like, yeah, this is the record, like this is what it needs to be, this is like what the order should be, and the sequence of songs like works perfectly for it. So very relieved about that. Definitely did not have quite as much of a hatred period around this particular set of songs as some of the last ones. And yeah, I think a lot of it for this was really just because I was like tapping into these things that were very formative for me, and kind of wrestling with that influence in a way, trying to wrestle with that influence in a way that isn't necessarily super obvious.
Mari, I'm a huge fan of this one. This is great. I think, as you say, with the fleetingness as well, there is. I could ask you a lot of questions about this and
Sure.
drill you forever. But the whole strawberry season, there is a sense of emergence with it that never really goes away. Like it never kind of emerges, which I love because it brings me back in over and over again. So I personally am
Great.
having the best
Thank
time
you.
with it.
Oh, thank you. Love to hear that. Yeah.
Other people should go and have the best time with it too. I'll put links in the show notes, and yes, please do check it out. Now, Mari, we should talk about your important records. One question I like to ask about this point is the word important and how you thought about it. So, was there a way that you understood the word important that led you to pick the 3 records that you did?
Yeah. I mean, there's so there's so many records. I initially, for some reason, I thought it was 10 records, and I just
Oh, no.
I ruinously debated those 10 albums. And I mean, I think important records, it's something that's always changing for me. There have definitely been some records that have been really important to me at one period of my life that I don't necessarily feel that way about anymore. They were really important and really special to me, in one moment, but they didn't necessarily doesn't necessarily apply to what I'm interested in now. And so something I thought about with these particular 3 records is I was thinking a lot about records that I've been listening to for a while, but that still have this sense of of impact in my life. It's every time I listen to them, I'm still kind of transported to the way I felt the first time I heard them. And I feel there are records too where no matter how many times I listen to them, I am able to pull something new from it. And in each case with the ones I picked, I was yeah, these are ones that I've been listening to since I was, in some cases, pretty young. That just kind of refused to leave my purview in a way. It's just it's been a consistent presence in my life.
Nice. Okay, great. Which one do you want to talk about first?
Why don't we start with Eureka by Jim O'Rourke?
Cool. All right, nice. So, Murray, give me a little introduction as to why this one's important to you.
I mean, this record is kind of everything for me. I feel when I heard it, it was talking about the idea of earlier about the future is the past and present. It felt like that the first time I heard it. And I will actually never forget it because I was 19 and I was hanging out with my friend Caitlin and actually my current partner Pamela, and we went to Austin, and just I was living in San Antonio at the time, and we went to Austin, and on a whim I decided to purchase this album. I'd known Jim O'Rourke's production, and I was starting to get into experimental music. But I was just okay, I've heard a lot of really good things about his solo records. I had an older bandmate in this band I was in called Moth Fight who had really raved about Jim O'Rourke, but wasn't super accessible or easy to find, especially in San Antonio at that time. But I saw that they had Eureka, and I was yeah, I'm just gonna get this. And I put it on the car ride home, and all of us just freaked out. We were because it sounded so much like things that at that time in kind of 2008 2009 were really popular, a lot of kind of more orchestral pop and even sort of more I don't know, folktronic, for lack of a better term, things that were happening. And we were just what the fuck? I can't believe this exists, and it's from 1999, and there are all these things, and it sounds so, but yet it sounds so new. and it sounds so different. And it really was like the beginning of this full blown obsession for me.
Mm.
And so, because of this record, I got into a lot of other really great music of Jim O'Rourke's and also the people who are involved with the record as well. Just, really kind of like chasing every single possible thread. I think that this record, too, just in terms of the way it sounds and what it does, like compositionally, it's hard for me to imagine a record that like appeals to everything I'm interested in more.
Right.
Um, because it's like I feel like Jim O'Rourke does this thing where he really takes he draws from these disparate influences and these disparate ideas, but he turns it into this thing that's like extremely consistent, but also that feels like totally new. The opening track being an Ivor Cutler cover that just like totally explodes and expands that song, I think is like a really huge example of that. And also just I think kind of the idea of synthesizing all of these different things into something that feels entirely new and that's like really nice to listen to, but also challenging and sort of bizarrely shaped in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Um, is something that like I just really, really love about this record.
And there's a Burt Bacharach cover as well, right? Something
Yes,
big.
yeah,
What do you make of that?
yeah. I think it's great. It's one of these things where it seems like it shouldn't work in the context of all of this. I mean, it's like I think on paper when you're like, okay, this has like this 9 minute like very electronic title track that like dissolves into to drone and like blipping synthesizers. And then it also has a Burt Bacharach cover. And then it has this almost 10-minute Ivor Cutler cover that is just like has a ton of orchestration. But it's really just the same, melody and chord progression for that 9 minutes. You would think like, okay, this sounds like a mess, but it doesn't sound that way at all. It all flows together and is like extremely consistent, and it just sort of creates its own universe in the process. It's like I think that one of the things I like so much about this record is that it sort of like connects the dots between all of these ideas so that you're like, oh, there isn't anything that different from like, say someone who's like on Audition's Migo and Burt Bacharach and Ivor Cutler all in one. And I think that that's like was something that really excited me and continues to excite me. This morning in preparation for this interview, I listened to it again and haven't listened to it in like a few months. I'd listened to it with my bandmates recently while we were in Portland for a festival because someone had never heard it and they had kind of a similar reaction where I put on, Women of the World and they're just like, what is happening? Like, like it's amazing. Like how, like what is going on here? And so that was like listening to it again. There's so much in it that like I've listened to this record like probably literally hundreds of times, and I feel like I still notice things that are new, like these details or arrangements or melodic choices. And like today, I was noticing how there's this part on Movie on the Way Down, which is my favorite song on the album. And in the beginning, there's all of these just kind of low, like synth sounds and like almost kind of like what sounds like it might be like a classical record sample or something slowed down, like while all of these shakers and guitar are happening. And I was like, I've
Mm.
never noticed this like low kind of undulating thing in the background. And I had that moment too on I think it was Through the Night Softly where I noticed this like one cello part that it's kind of like a counter melody and catchy. I was like, oh, it's just one note. It's just one note playing off of like this much more complicated melody. And then I was also thinking today about how a lot of the like instrumental songs have these sort of like way in the background wordless vocal parts. And I think that's definitely something that's like obviously been really influential in my music as well. And so yeah, I'm just obsessed with this record. I love everything about it.
I was really struck by the lyrics to a lot of the tracks. I know some of them are
Yes.
covers. I'm not
Hmm.
a lyrics person generally at all, but I think the sound and the general kind of tenor of the lyrics in combination is pretty wonderful. So I wondered, if is that a part of the record that you connect with as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the lyrics to this record I think are incredible. It's like he has such a knack with the lyrics he writes of being so like mean and funny,
Yeah.
but also like totally devastating at the same time. The lyrics to "Movie on the Way Down" just like wreck me almost every time I hear it, and it's like it is really funny in this way. It sounds like almost kind of like condescending, like, "Do you feel pride?" But it's also just like a total wrecker of a line to hear someone like just be like, "Does your family make you feel pride?" Uh,
Oh
and it's
god.
like it's like funny but weak and like
Hmm.
shattering at the same time. And so yeah, I definitely feel like the lyrics to this record have been very influential, and honestly even influential on Strawberry Season. I feel like the lyrics to the song "Gentle Pets" are very Jim O'Rourke in a way, in that it's like this song that is about looking forward to seeing someone that you're like obsessed with who like literally barely remembers who you are.
Right,
And
right.
so I feel like that, was kind of like like a very influential thing. And I think that there are some other moments as well that are heavily indebted to the way that Jim writes. And yeah, I love the words on this. I love the kind of abstract um, scenes that are painted on the last two tracks, in particular on the title track itself, and
Mm-hmm.
then on the final song on the record too. It's just like, well, on "Happy Holidays," the lyrics to "Happy Holidays" are so funny, but also like it just, you get this sense of these bizarre locations and scenes. Like I feel like "Happy Holidays," I hear that and like I imagine some like White Lotus type of setting. I mean, same thing with like "Eureka" too, but "Eureka" it feels almost like robotic in this way. And
Hmm.
like this kind of vision of hell that's also this like vision of paradise at the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
time. And
exactly.
yeah, and I love that. I feel like that's always something I'm trying to like create too. I love the contrast of like of writing these things that are like abstract but about like very sort of I guess in a way like very American, very sort of notions of like what should be like pleasant and like enjoyable from this like capitalistic viewpoint. And I think that
Yeah.
he does that, and it's like so snarky and pointed in this way, but it doesn't ever feel like overwrought or to me it never feels overwrought, and it never feels like something where he's like condescending. It's like this very kind of winking thing, and I think at the same time there's a good amount of like sadness in that too.
Oh
And
yeah.
that's like something I love, is like when you can be like funny and snarky but also like make me feel something and make me feel sad. Like yeah, I'm yours forever, basically, like in terms of like songwriters who can do that.
Lovely. Yeah. I get the impression because he does have this really um this veneer of like pleasure and like opulence almost to it at times.
Yes. Yeah.
Um and he sounds like someone who is, it's almost like hyper presented though in that way, because it's I I've not listened to this record before you pitched it for the podcast, so this has been really cool for me. But it sounds like just someone who sees the world that way because things are going a bit shit for him.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly. And that's like, I mean, that's, I feel like kind of like with Strawberry Season 2, that's like definitely a bit of the kind of like subtext and narrative there too. Is it's like, yeah, you might as well enjoy Strawberry Season because like we're probably all gonna die sooner than later. Like, and I think that that's like, I think that that's very present in Jim O'Rourke's like lyrics, especially with Eureka, where it's like you feel like there's this like, it feels like you're at like a resort watching the world burn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where you're just like, yeah, like everything is like pleasant and beautiful, but like also like shit's pretty fucked up. Like,
right, exactly. Yeah.
It's like, women of the world, you better take over because the world is going to end. Like, I feel like that like sets the tone for the entire rest of the record.
Yeah, that one's difficult because the melody is so infectious. So I've been singing it around my house, but like heralding the apocalypse around my toddler is not good vibes.
Love that, yeah.
I mean, yeah, so I wanted to actually ask you something about that. Maybe this is a good time to do it because I feel like with Strawberry Season, you've got the supermarket. Again, there's this like real artificial kind of capitalist veneer of normality, which feels, I think, at times pretty intense, pretty like, I don't know, aggressive. But also I've heard you talk about on the album Murray, I think, you talk about airports at a certain point too. I wonder if there's something about these spaces, these kind of artificially constructed sort of spaces that just tick by, that is particularly compelling to you.
Oh yeah, I'm obsessed with this. It's like something I'm like kind of endlessly fascinated by, especially growing up where I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, in the like late 90s and early 2000s. I feel like I really saw a lot of that kind of like suburban constructed capitalist like environment excess, and like the song Low Resolution at Santikos is like very specifically about Santikos movie theater there.
Oh wow.
Like that was like right next to where I grew up, and it has like, it's like kind of like dumpy, and they sort of continually try to turn it into like this more like boutique theater with like food and stuff, but you know, they're still showing like Marvel movies. Like there's not like an art house theater or anything, but it like also has continually had this like aesthetic of like kind of late 80s, early 90s, and it's like very neon and like has these columns out front. And it's been something I've been really obsessed with, and kind of similarly with like airports too, and how it's like this artificial environment. And for a while I worked for this company where we actually like worked out of a WeWork office space, and working out of that, it especially feels, I haven't finished the WeWork documentary, but they kind of touch upon this in the documentary, of like creating this like weird artificial space that you're supposed to feel like comfortable with and like at home in. And so this is something like I've been continually fascinated by, like the idea that you have these, like you essentially are creating these like worlds within worlds, but in this like very capitalistic, like consumer based way. And I find it really interesting what that does to culture that's around that, and how that affects people's comfort with things in the world. And I also find it really interesting how it affects like your perception of a city, or it affects your perception of culture, really, of like being like, oh, this is like what I understand as like art, or this is what I understand as music. There's a place in Austin that is like terrible, but I'm obsessed with it, called The Domain. And The Domain is this giant outdoor shopping mall that actually has like apartments built into it. And it basically looks like they made a fake downtown, but the downtown is all like retail stores and like, you know, California Pizza Kitchen and chains and stuff.
Oh, wow.
but it's huge. And I've been like kind of obsessed with this place for a while because you go there and you are just like, I'm in another reality. I'm in this reality that someone has invented of telling me this is like the cultural epicenter of Austin, but it's all this corporate shit. And
Right.
one of the things that told me they had friends who came to visit and they stayed in the domain, and the entire time they were in the domain they thought they were in downtown Austin.
Oh
And
no.
they did not realize. I mean, it's like this place is like 20-minute drive away from like the middle of the actual city. And to me it was just so fascinating to hear something like that, because it's like, yeah, you can be, these types of spaces create this environment that can make you feel so detached from what the actual reality of a place is.
Hmm.
Um, and so like I'm like constantly thinking about that. And I think that is definitely something I like love about Eureka, is like the whole album kind of, to me at least, feels like it's touching upon that. Like it's touching upon this idea of like, we're existing in this space even though everything like outside of the space is on fire. Like this
Yes,
is
yeah.
what's going on inside of it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just kind of aggressively defies combustion. It's really, yeah,
Yeah.
it's so fascinating. Do you have, maybe this changes? I know you've had an undulating relationship with this record. Do you have a
Hmm.
favorite track?
Yeah, I think, you know, it consistently, it's Movie on the Way Down for me. That's the one that just like, both lyrically, it just like does everything I feel like I want in a song, where it starts off as one thing and becomes something completely different by the end of it. Where it
Hmm.
starts off and it's like this more atmospheric, almost ambient piece, and there are all of these, you know, there's just such a rich like tapestry of sounds going on. And then it gives way to this like super minimal like bass, trombone, and vocal song that is very loosely related to the beginning half. And it also has like my favorite lyrics of all time, which are, you know, equally devastating, but also like snarky and funny. and and I just like, I feel like I've definitely made multiple attempts in my life at like stealing all of the ideas in this track. Um, like I'm just obsessed with it. I'm like totally fascinated by how that song got created. And I feel like when I first got really into this record, I was in this phase of my life, like in, you know, being early in college, where I would put albums on my portable CD player to fall asleep often. And this would always be the moment where I would feel like I would do this with Eureka sometimes, and I feel like this would often be the moment that things would kind of start to slip for me.
Hmm.
um, and I like have this really positive association with that, but also it's just a track that like I um listen to all the time. And it's always the one where like if I'm showing this record to someone else for the first time, like everybody needs to shut up and like listen to how the arc of this unfolds, because it's like really amazing. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that it was like my favorite song the first time I listened to it, but it's one
Hmm.
of these things where it's just like the more and more I've played the record, I'm just shocked by it every time. And like I said, even today, it's like I've listened to the song, I mean, like an absurd amount of times. I would venture to say it's probably one of the most listened to songs of my entire life. And it's like
Wow.
even listening to it today, I'm like, there are textures and there are sounds that are so elegantly woven into the mix that I am noticing them for the first time.
let's go to your second important record now.
Let's talk about Private Parts by Robert Ashley.
Wicked. Yeah. So again, give me a little introduction as to why this one's important to you.
So Robert Ashley, I feel like was I feel like he really changed my perception of like what being a composer and artist could mean.
Hmm.
When I discovered his work, I was in college. I was in my doing my undergraduate degree, and I was pretty disillusioned. I was studying music composition, and I was pretty disillusioned with like the so-called world of like new music and like contemporary classical music. Which also the phrase new music to describe what is contemporary classical music, I think is one of the most insulting and just completely reductive things. It just ignores everything that actually is new music.
Right.
That's a
Yeah.
whole other conversation. But I will say I was feeling very disillusioned with that whole notion, and then basically this very Western prescribed idea of like what being a quote unquote composer meant.
Hmm.
And then of all things, I was starting to discover a lot of stuff from like, 70s and 80s experimental music that was kind of like rooted in this world or had like its roots in that world of like academia, but that was just going all of these different ways. And so I was getting really into like Alvin Lucier and Cornelius Cardew, people like that. And then I was exchanging mix CDs with this English professor I had at the time, and he put a track by Robert Ashley on one of the mix CDs. It was the song Tap Dancing in the Sand. And I was like, okay, like what is happening here? I had never really heard anything quite like it. And the idea that it was framed within this context of like sort of being an opera or being like this piece was totally fascinating to me. It was like I was like, oh my God, finally there's somebody else who's like thinking about this and trying to experiment in this way that isn't so just married to like these like very Western ideals of how you experiment like as a composer. And
Hmm.
so I could have really picked almost any Robert Ashley record. I have a tattoo of the album cover automatic writing on my arm. So
Wow.
obviously that one is really important to me as well. I feel like that is like one of my favorite pieces of music of all time. But in terms of like a record that I love to just continuously listen to, Private Parts really kind of takes the cake. And I think it does something kind of similar to Eureka, I think, in that it really captures this sort of Midwestern malaise, this very American, like, inundated with capital malaise. But I think that, like, what Robert Ashley does with it is he really it's something kind of similar to like how I feel that David Lynch works too, where it's like you really put it under this magnifying glass and you're like, this is weird. Like this is actually like a totally weird thing. And there's something that's like kind of like beautiful and like amazing about it, even though it's also like this deeply boring and deeply consumeristic thing.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's something I really love about the text to Private Parts. And I love the entirety of the opera Perfect Lives, which both of these pieces are in as well. But
Hmm.
I feel like these two pieces, as like their own contained work, are just like these really beautiful character studies in these sketches. Like I kind of prefer listening to them removed from like the greater context of the opera and as like this sort of like mini operetta itself.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that there were a lot of things about hearing this piece that were so influential to me because it's like it it is deceptively simple and complicated at the same time, and that you have like, kind of limited harmonic materials and these really repetitive rhythms, but they're sort of always shaping, like changing and undulating based off of how he's speaking.
Hmm.
Um, and then I also really just love the idea of like, I think one of the things that was like huge for me is like, I loved the idea of self-performing your work and really putting these things about yourself that are very specific, like to you, like in this case Robert Ashley's voice and his delivery, and the inflections in which he speaks. So like kind of finding this naturalistic pitch that he or like another vocalist would feel comfortable speaking these words in rhythm to.
Hmm.
um that's something I feel like I was always really interested in, because I kind of strongly I strongly dislike the idea in like Western classical music and Western composition of like virtuosity and it being this thing that is, allegedly quantifiable across like an instrument.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I love the idea. I feel like what Robert Ashley does with his voice and his text and with the piano playing of Blue Jean Tyranny and then the work of the tabla player who's involved in these records as well, is he really plays to individual strengths and individual quirks in these cases too, like compositionally. And I think that that's something that was like really eye-opening to me too, because I always felt very at odds with those ideas of virtuosity in classical music, uh because like even though I, am like quote unquote classically trained in that world, my background is largely in folk music and largely in growing up listening to like a lot of like indie rock and a lot of like lo-fi pop and punk and stuff. And that is music that to me, I feel like it feels more naturalistic and I feel like doesn't care about, it's all about like specificity. And I think that this was like a really interesting way to deal with that in this like more like academic compositional sense. And I love that like all of his music is like that. Like automatic writing is about capturing utterances and kind of like a form of Tourette's that he has. And I think
Yeah.
that that is like such a like a wonderful and amazing idea too, that it becomes this thing that's like very personal, but also very universal, and it also just like sounds great. It like is so enjoyable to listen to. It's hypnotic,
Hmm.
the way he speaks. And I love the fact that I can put it on and it's like I have the kind of like novel of all the text to Perfect Lives, and so like I've read the actual text to this piece many times. But I also love that the meaning of the text is kind of besides the point. It's more about like getting locked into this this repetition and this like kind of like just picking these pieces of the narrative out and like the way certain phrases and words jump out to you. And I like really love that sensation of not having it have to be this thing that is necessarily like super that you're super engaged with. It can be more of this kind of like ambient backdrop that you sort of sink into, but
Hmm.
then like it's almost like you're subliminally affected by, hearing Robert Ashley say two G's and eggs. Like all of a sudden, like your ear will catch on a phrase like that, and you're like, "Oh, what is going on here?" And so I love that about it, and I love that even though like I know the text, I know like what these sketches are conveying. When I listen to it, I don't ever really fully understand where we are or what's
Yeah.
happening. And
Yeah.
I think that that's something that like I never get sick of with listening to this piece. And it's definitely something that like I feel like the whole way Robert Ashley approaches voice and text is very impactful for how I write lyrics and treat vocals too. Where it's like I kind of don't like I spend a lot of time on lyrics, but I know that they're not always necessarily super like coherent
Hmm.
to like just from a sonic level. And it's because I really like that element of mystery of like all of a sudden a phrase might just pop out to you. You may all of a sudden understand like the text of what's happening. And a lot of times I don't necessarily include lyrics um with my records, partially because I want listeners to have that experience of like, oh, I'm sort of like catching on and like gleaning these things as I'm listening to it. Because that's like how I experienced this music for the first time. It was like very hard to get a hold of private parts. And I think eventually, I don't remember if I found it on MediaFire and like the glory days of, MP3 sharing, but there are also so many Robert Ashley pieces that I was able to get through interlibrary loan in college
Oh,
because at
cool.
some point I figured out, oh, I can just put in a request through the library and they'll send this to me. They'll just send me all of this weird music because it wasn't like there was like this huge demand for people looking at. And so I would just be like, yeah, I'm gonna interlibrary loan request like every Robert Ashley CD I can possibly order. And so I did that for a while, and I'm so happy that now they've like repressed this album and automatic writing to vinyl and to CD. And they've like done a new recording of why am I blanking on it? It's like one of my favorite pieces of his. I'm awful with song title names. This is something that is like a true flaw of my brain. Is song titles. I can tell you everything about piece, but the Improvement is the name of the opera. But like, yeah, they like just did a new recording of Improvement, and I think that there's another opera that he finished right before he passed away that like has come out too. So I'm still kind of like waiting for like the full renaissance because I feel like if people treated Robert Ashley with the same level of like analysis as like Beethoven, the world would genuinely be a better place.
For sure, yeah. Yeah. I think you and Claire Rousey did a mix actually a little while back. Apologies, I can't remember who it was for, but I think it was called Lyrics That Are Timeless. And
Yes, yeah. It was for foil. Uh-huh.
yeah, thank you. So I think either yourself or Claire picked Change from now Eleanor's
It was me.
idea, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
I figured it might be
it was
based on
me.
this. Cool. Yeah, talk to me about that. So, how did that make into the mix? And yeah, tell me about your connection to that one.
Oh, I mean, I love now Eleanor's idea because once I think I exhausted all of the interlibrary loan things I could get, I started just buying the operas on iTunes, and that was one of the ones that was available um, at the time, and I love that piece. I think now Eleanor's idea is great, and it's one of these pieces too where it's like one thing I remember reading about Robert Ashley from the artist Ed Murtha. Oh, what's her last name? You probably know who I'm talking about. She has releases on Astral Spirits and like
Oh,
works with
Amata
Leah
Kadambi?
Tucci.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. She had this great blog post back in the day about like cultural appropriation, and one of the things she talked about specifically was like how Robert Ashley is the rare composer who deals with these like Eastern influences or these just like, these themes that are like not white themes, but does it in this way that isn't like disrespectful or directly taking from another culture. And one of the examples she gives is like, Perfect Lies being influenced by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but how a lot of those ideas are just manifested in the way that he writes and
Hmm.
like really subtly in the form of music. It's like he's not going out and writing like, a bunch of like vague Eastern sounding stuff like, like Hans Zimmer in the new Dune movie.
Right.
He's just like he's taking these influences and it's just like I like this has profoundly affected me, but I can like express this and show this in this way that's very, respectful and like isn't overtly like stealing from another culture. And I think now Eleanor's idea is an interesting example of that too, because there's all this writing in it about like lowriders and like Mexican culture. And he like apparently spent a bunch of time in New Mexico speaking with people who were part of like these like lowrider communities and working with them, and then actually like at the staging of the opera had a like lowrider car showcase coinciding with it at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And I think that it's like it's a super fascinating thing because obviously that culture is like really huge in Texas as well, and is like something you see a lot growing up. And I think that he really like the way he treats it and talks about it in Now Eleanor's Idea is in no way this it doesn't feel like this kind of like novelty or like you're meant to laugh at it. It's like treated as this like religious experience for these people and for this like group. And I love the way that that's folded in with this character Eleanor, who is like in Perfect Lives and is in Improvement, and how like it's this sort of continuation, but it's like it still is existing in that kind of like space that we were talking about earlier too, of
Mm,
you know these sort of like interesting constructed spaces, but how like a culture like grows out of that, how like this culture or this like beauty grows out of that. And so Eleanor's Idea I really love, and I love how that opera, like a lot of his later works, is super glossy and shiny and electronic sounding. And yeah, I was really excited about the idea of marrying that with like some of the other tracks we were working on, and that we were including in that mix. And I mean, I feel like there's kind of no one else that really sounds like Robert Ashley, but
mm,
I feel like you can hear elements of his work in so much contemporary music because it's like whether it be like electronics or like treatment of voice, it's just yeah, to me it's like it's so obvious that it's there.
yeah, yeah. That point you raise as well about the cultural appropriation. I think there's a line in Private Parts which caught my ear today because I think it so overtly and knowingly occurs within a sort of nod to New Age. I guess it kind of knows that it's got that quality that it's kind of questioning, right?
Yeah.
But there's a
What was the
line in it.
line?
He says something from the East, which kind of comes out. I think it's in the first piece, but
Yeah.
it just struck me because I was like, that almost feels like a remark on that sort of generic treatment of something from the East as being just that, just that sweeping quality often be
Mm-hmm.
applied from the Western gaze, which I thought was great. But also there's another line on a different note where I think he just says the words "very abstract,"
Yes, yeah.
which I really like.
I
Because
love that too because it's like it's so. I mean, it's like it's so self-aware and it's so funny. I think that was another thing that really struck me about his work too was that like I had been I had always like been really interested in making work that was like, kind of like to some degree has a sense of humor about it or is sort of like wrestling with like a lot of these contemporary ideas. And I feel like kind of the only way you can really do that is to laugh
yeah, yeah,
in some ways. And I feel like his work was like one of the first things I heard where I was like, wow, this is like, it's actually talking about like real things, and it's also very like knowing about the fact that it is an abstract piece of music and that it's like drawing these influences, and it's like there's this whole kind of meta commentary of this guy, this like older midwestern man who is like realizing how this looks like to somebody outside who would be like within maybe his social circle normally.
mm,
And so I love that. I love those moments. And like he's also one of these people who I feel like kind of like Jim O'Rourke too. It's like I love things that toe that line between being funny and snarky and also like very beautiful and devastating. And I think that that's like a huge thing within Private Parts too, because it's like it's just gorgeous musically, and like there are parts of it that are like very profound and beautiful, but then it's like the actual scene being described as just this guy wandering around his hotel room and masturbating, and you're like,
yeah.
incredible. And so like I love that about like all of his work too. And it's like I think automatic writing really has that, even though that's like, this abstract, like pretty intense listen, like that, there are moments where all of a sudden you can hear him say where like I can always think of this one part where the voices are just like so in the background on automatic writing, and then all of a sudden you hear him say, "Who taught me everything I know," very clearly.
Wow.
And I've always like it always like really gets me. And then another, I mean, there's so many examples of that. There's a moment in Improvement where like there's supposed to be a scene of this woman talking to her therapist, and the therapist just keeps going, "Just a moment, please," over and over again. And it's like this crazy like vocoded chord every time it happens. Um, but like then the actual conversation that this woman is having with the therapist is like very intense and very very dark. But then it's always interrupted by "Just a moment, please," and it's like this like crazy thing. And so like I love that about his work too. It's like something that I feel like, yeah, it has been very influential for me too, of like, similar kind of like towing that line in a way.
That's great. I should say as well, this is the second time it's been picked in like I think
Oh,
the
really?
last 5, 6 episodes. Yeah, Jenny Bergamira picked it as well.
Oh, interesting. That
For her
makes sense.
episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, I do feel like everyone who does know Robert Ashley's work gets obsessed. It's like
Hmm.
I think that like everyone I know who is really passionate about his music, they're all like incredible artists usually in their own right. It's just like it's like I think you there's something about it that like it just when you get really into it, like you're kind of it's usually a sign that you're like a lifer in some way.
With a slightly blue body light. When he is alone, he forgets sometimes to walk. He just moves. Sometimes they touch, sometimes they don't, and everything in between. As sometimes he forgets to combine talk with thinking, and just thinks, or just talks.
Okay, Murray, we've got one more important record. If you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you.
Absolutely. So the final one is Product by Sophie. So this record was really important to me. I feel like actually what we were just talking about with Robert Ashley is a great segue to talk about this too, because I feel like this is music that is very challenging, but
Mm.
very fun and funny at the same time. But it also has these moments that are like very sincerely beautiful and devastating. And I think that like I love all of her work, but I feel like this record just feels so modern to me every time I listen to it. And I think I really heard it at like the perfect time in my life. I had just moved back to Texas from California, and I was playing to and going to a lot of harsh noise shows.
Right.
And I remember one night being at the show, and there was someone DJing who was playing nothing but this early PC music stuff. So it's like, things like Pink and Blue and Every Night by Hannah Diamond, and then some of these early Sophie singles. And I was like, what is this? I was like, this is like everything I want right now, because it sounds so alien and so strange, but it still is clearly pop. It's like clearly pop music.
Hmm.
But it's also like very challenging at the same time. And I remember like that night I went home and I just like downloaded everything I could from this scene. And then like the next year they released Product as this like compilation with like the singles and everything. And I feel like the way that this album is sequenced, all the tracks are sequenced and presented, is just like undeniable with this record. And also, I think that like there are so many things I love about it, like the sound design of everything. I like just don't know what's happening. Anytime I like listen to a record and I'm just like, I don't know how this person is doing this, that is usually a surefire sign I'm going to like be obsessed with it. And I still get that sense every time I listen to this record. I feel like gradually there have been things I've started to be like, okay, I can kind of see how like this was made, but like what is going on with like this track? Um, and I love how there are all of these details, how it's like so clearly lovingly labored over, but that those details are just like oftentimes so absurd. Like my favorite track on this album is Hard.
Yeah,
Um,
same.
and like there are so many moments in it where things just like stop or like a sound just changes, and I'm like totally obsessed with that. Like anytime, and it makes me also think of like one of my favorite songs is Small Talk by Screedy Politi. And I feel like this is like, and I know like A.G. Cook has talked a bit about being really influenced by that band. I wonder if Sophie was as well. But I feel like it's almost reminds me of like the most like kind of like grotesque almost permutation of that,
Hmm.
of like just like everything's changing in this way that's like really elegant but like also really kind of ridiculous.
Hmm.
And I think also I'm realizing now, I like this was completely unintentional, but like I think it is also very much, I mean, given the name of the record and everything too, it very much fits in that same kind of space of like really commenting on these like constructed spaces, these constructed like zones and spaces, and taking into account all of these things with like consumerism. And I hadn't really, I like truly, this was not a planned move
It's
until we started
beautifully done.
talking about all these. But I guess this is like, I mean, it makes sense because it's something I'm super fascinated by. But I definitely think Product is like a huge example of that, and it does it very much like on its sleeve with like taking all these elements of like top 40 pop music and of music that I feel like at the time was not necessarily super popular. It's like I feel like you can hear these really warped, deconstructed, like, you know, permutations of like, you know, the Venga Boys or like Aqua in some of these songs and
Oh
the
yeah.
lyrics, and like in the way the voices are treated. And I remember that felt so exciting to me when I heard this record for the first time, and when I heard these songs for the first time, I was just like, oh my God, like it's like someone took this thing that is really like kind of like the goofiest, like cartoony, corny thing, and is mashing it with like the most abstract, confounding music.
Hmm.
And that was something that just like was so exciting to me, and like I feel like has always been something that like has driven a lot of like my own work of just asking these questions of like what happens if, you know, yeah, if like I pair like Aqua with like Audiker, you know, or something like that.
That's
um
it. Yeah.
and I think that that's like that's just something I like love so much about this record. And I feel like I've had a lot of really interesting like relation I've had a very interesting and like kind of diverse set of relationships with this record too, because it's something that like, you know, I'm very moved by emotionally for a number of reasons. But also at the same time, I've like literally like worked out to this record. Like Hard was on my like, you know, workout playlist for years. And like I've had it on like party playlist and like DJ'd with these tracks. And so it's one of these things where I just feel like it has had so many different lives for me in terms of how I've listened to it and enjoyed it. And I also think it's really interesting too, because I feel like it is this rare record of this sort where I think that Sophie's work is just undeniable to most people. It's like you may not be super into what she's doing, but I feel like everyone I talk to about Sophie is just like, yeah, like it's incredible, like because
Yeah.
it's just so detail oriented and it just really doesn't sound like anyone else. I feel like there are a lot of people too who it's like you who like kind of try to imitate this production, but it is just so impossible to recreate, in terms of just like the attention to detail, the processing, the like humor that's involved in it, without it seeming like super jokey or like a novelty track. I think that that's one of the things that's like so impressive to me about this record is it's like a track like Lemonade, I feel like could be so easily turned into something that's just like really cartoonish and goofy, and yet you listen to it and it's just like bizarre and amazing and incredible, but it's also funny.
Yeah, this is wicked. I just find it amazing that something this bright and full on can also feel very unfathomable, I think, as you've said.
Yeah.
It's exactly, incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact as well that Sophie got pulled, I guess, into doing pop productions like Charlie XCX and Madonna to kind of varied critical appraisal, as much as that means anything, it kind of indicates this fact that it's like pop as a general scene knew that it wanted Sophie in there somewhere, but no one was really sure, like, we ready for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will be catching up to the ideas on this record for like decades to come, because there's just so much to unpack there. And I do think, like, I mean, when I started seeing that she was producing some of these top artists, I can remember as that was happening just being like, no way. Like, it felt so exciting to me, because I was just like, oh my God, like, I can't believe that people are taking this seriously, that people are just like, yeah, we want this sound for our music. And I think it just like truly speaks to how undeniable like her work is, how undeniable her sounds are, and how undeniable like her songwriting is, because it's like also at the core of all of these tracks, it's like there are hooks, even the stuff that's like, even the like LOVE song, which is like basically a harsh noise track. It's like, I feel like there's still like this little like plinky melody that comes in, and it's like I could like, you know, hum it back. You know, it's crazy. It's like that stuff is just so apparent. It seems like it's really a true love letter to pop music and to like the possibilities of what pop music can be. And I think that's one of the things that like excites me about this album so much, and excites me about like a lot of those like kind of first wave of PC music artists, was that like it was just so clear that they liked so much music, and that it was like all coming from this place of genuine interest and curiosity, and like kind of figuring out how they could like stretch and work these things out. And like, yeah, because it is like, yeah, there is something that's just like so fun about like, you know, kind of like 90s pop house, and something like Ace of Base, or, you know, Venga Boys, or any of these people I was mentioning earlier. But like the idea of asking the question like, well, where can this go? Like, what if this was just more than this? Like, I feel like it's, that idea still seems really fresh to me. I think that even though there are all of these other permutations and like people kind of like trying to take these sounds and going in more pop directions with it, I feel like no one is quite doing it like the same way as this record. I like don't know how to fully like define it other than that. It's just like, yeah, this is like such a singular piece of work, and so many of those other tracks, like the early A.G. Cook stuff and Danielle Harl stuff, is like all like in that same vein.
What I found really fascinating was seeing Sophie talk about, there's interview clips, and I'm gonna, this isn't a direct quote, but it's in the area of how Sophie eschewed a lot of the traditional kind of percussive frameworks in you know, the productions that Sophie was doing. So I think getting rid of hand claps or like kick drums and stuff. But when you'd like, I found it almost tense to listen, because I was like, how are you doing this? Because you know, I cling on to that kind of stuff for dear life. You know, they're like stabilizers, and to hear someone who just doesn't need that at all, and yet, unless you're consciously listening out for the absence of these things, you'd never be like, cool, you know what, just like a hi-hat every quarter beat would be great here. Like, you never wish for it. It's just so amazing.
I think I know what interview you're talking about, because there's a quote of hers of just like, I don't understand like why when you have access to create this whole array of sounds, you can have sounds that are like abstract as you want and manipulated as much as you want, that you would use like, you know, the same 808 drum, or that you would treat the same 808 drum the exact same way that everyone else has treated it. And I think that that's something that like I mean, it's like I love like traditional instruments as well, obviously, but I think that that's something I'm always kind of like asking myself too, is like, how can I treat this differently, or how can I use like what equipment I have, what instruments I have, and do something with it that is going to not be like kind of like what this is intended for. Like, if I have all of these possibilities, why can't I just like go as far as I want to with that? And I feel like definitely some of the sounds on this record were like very influential for some of the like more sequence based tracks on Strawberry Season, like Cold and Blank Check, and Low Resolution and Santikos. I was really trying to program these things where different parts of like the notes in the sequence would change based off of like logic that I input to the electronic cycles, like saying, okay, every time this beat comes up, it's going to change to this sound. So like the snare drum's never going to be the same sound, or the synthesizer's never going to be the same sound. And it's like this very subtle thing, but definitely like, you know, a track like Hard is like super like powerful with that. And I think that that was definitely something that really struck me about her production and work, was that it didn't adhere to like these kind of normal rules of how you would treat like instruments.
Yeah, absolutely. So your favorite track, you say, is Hard. Has that always been your favorite?
Let me actually think about that. Yeah, I think Hard, it's a real toss-up between Hard and Just Like We Never Said Goodbye. Because Just Like We Never Said Goodbye, I think, is such a sincerely beautiful love song. And it's like it's truly moving. And I think that one of the things that is so great about it is like, it's so moving, but the sound palette doesn't change. And I think for me too, that was like one of these things where I was like really impacted by how you could make something that sounded so sincere and so beautiful, but with like the same set of tools that you're making this music that's like, you know, like at times like funny and like challenging, and going all of these other directions. And so like I remember when I first heard that track and first got to it, I was just like floored, like completely speechless, because I was just like, I cannot believe that like this sounds the same as like Visey or Lemonade, but it's this like sincere love song. And I think that that's like a testament to like how this is music that is like really rooted in pop. So I love Just Like We Never Said Goodbye, but I'm totally obsessed with Hard. I've DJ'd with Hard so many times, and one of my favorite things to do is to loop. There's that like kind of broken down synth build, and that particular part, the chords and the melodies and the way it's like edited and kind of like ramps back up, like has genuinely made me cry, just because it's like so incredible, like how everything is just sort of flying around in that moment sonically. And when I've like DJ'd with that, I like will loop that part just like into oblivion and start playing other tracks over it. Like I'll like start playing like house beats with it, because it's just so beautiful and so amazing. And I just love all those details in that song too, of like just the sounds are constantly changing. And there's also something that I think is really interesting about that too, where that song has these parts that are like very dissonant, and these like riffs that are almost like proggy that come in on the verses. But then it's still so pop. It's like complete like bubblegum bliss at the same time. And so I'm just like constantly in awe of that song. And I've listened to like there's I think an old Boiler Room DJ set that she has too, where she does this really long expanded intro with that song, and when she finally like actually drops the part where like the beat comes in, like you just get the sense that everyone is losing their mind because it's just like the hard the like rapping section that just is like looped a cappella, and then finally like all the metallic like percussive stuff comes in, and it's like, you know, it's just a direct recording of the audio, but you get the sense listening to it, you're just like, yeah, I would freak out like if I heard this in person.
Mari, I have one more question for you, which is
Sure.
about your listening and purchasing music generally. So we've covered a little bit of Mediafire, interlibrary loans. I don't know how much that has come up on the podcast, but it's great to hear it. I'm, such a library fan.
Happy to be an interlibrary loan stand.
So I don't know how many records you're currently loaning out at the moment, but where do you tend to get your music from these days in terms of purchasing it, and where do you tend to listen to it?
I mean, I listen to a lot of things digitally. I stream a lot of things just like via Apple Music. I buy a lot of things on Bandcamp too. Literally, actually, right before this interview started, I bought 2 records on Bandcamp.
Oh, nice.
I'm pretty insatiable in terms of my listening habits. It's like I just kind of constantly want to hear new things, but I love coming back to things. It makes the things that I want to come back to over and over again feel really special. Because I'm just trying to constantly like expose myself to as much music as possible. And like, I just generally love listening to new things. Like one of my favorite things to do, and one of the best perks of my job is that I get to like listen to music all day. And so I just like sit around and I like listen to records and do my like little emails, and I love it. I love that I can just like listen to as many things as I possibly can throughout the day. So the records I bought the new Ulla Strauss and then the new Elite Gymnastics record. Really love both of those artists a lot. Jamie Brooks, who does Elite Gymnastics, her like last records as Default Genders is so great, and I've been following Ulla like since her first release, and she's just like consistently amazing. I think all of her work is super beautiful and very diverse at the same time. So yeah, I buy a lot of things from Bandcamp too. And then actually I've had this recent development in my life where I have a car that is like kind of early 2010s car. And so it doesn't have like a Bluetooth. It has Bluetooth, but it doesn't really work. The quality is really bad, and it often cuts out because they haven't really figured that out. And it has an aux, but then it has like a crazy CD player. And so I've started buying a lot of CDs again.
Yes.
And like I listen to a lot of things on CD in the car. A lot of times I'll purchase things like if there's a record available from Boomcat that is like CD and download, or if it's a CD only. Like I think I have like 3 Terry Timolet CDs, like DJ Sprinkles things in the car right now that are all from Boomcat. And then I have like I'll go to like, you know, record stores like Innoveneer or Waterloo in Austin and occasionally purchase like CDs just for the car. But I listen to, and most of my listening is just like on my phone, but it's nice to have the physical things. And like, as I've been buying CDs again too, I've like kind of forgotten how much I miss having the CD booklets and being able to like really kind of dive in and look at these liner notes and things that like, you know, information you can't necessarily find online because I'm always like obsessed with the context behind things.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I like as well. Albums in cars are great. It's kind of, I don't know about you, but I just keep one in the player, which feels very novel when you have the kind of transients of a digital music library. You're like, it's like an album in residence. You get in that car and it's like, I'm playing this. It's great. You get a very specific relationship with those records.
Yeah, I've definitely had that with this one DJ Sprinkles record that's been in my car, and I had the Celia Hollander record that Leaving released last year in my car too for a long time and listened to it. And now I've swapped a few of those out, and I still have the DJ Sprinkles in there, but I also have like Juana Molina and Laid by James. And especially listening to the James record, I haven't listened to that in like probably 10 years. And it's been really interesting just being kind of like, oh yeah, like just being forced to sit with this record. Yeah.
It's a nice way to put it. Well, Mari, thank you so much. I mean, what a treat to speak about your record, Strawberry Season. Like I say, people should definitely be getting on that. And then also your 3 important records were wicked too. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was a pleasure to speak with you as well.
Ace. And to everyone listening, see you next time. Goodbye.